Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to have you with us at our study in the book of Titus. There's a parallel passage we'll be touching on in 1 Timothy 3. We'll be looking at some other passages as well. This message is for 317:24, but you can listen to it anyway, anytime that you want to. And we're looking specifically at Titus chapter 1 and verse 17, for the overseer must be above reproach. He cannot be grabbed in any way and anything stick to him. So there's nothing really a big deal in his life. As God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain. Well, what we need to look at is that phrase, not addicted to wine. Some people read that and they think, well, that means that he can drink wine, but he just can't be addicted to it. He can't be somebody that drinks all the time. And I could see where they could get that from that translation. But there are other translations as well that are slightly different. Not given to wine. He doesn't drink much wine. But frankly, friends, that word there that's translated not addicted to wine is two words, me peroin and or par oinon. It's a compound word, para, which means alongside of or in the vicinity of, and wine, oinos. So in the vicinity of wine, not near wine. And so there's this idea of pulling back from it, that you're not using it. And so this word me par oinon is only used twice in the New Testament. And you can't hardly find it any other place where it's used, except those two places. And in each instance, it has to do with the qualifications for an elder. Here in Titus chapter 1 and verse 7, and also in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7. Let me make sure I give you the right reference. 3 and verse 7. No, 1 Timothy 3 and verse 3. Okay. And it's the same two words, me par oinon, used in each one of those instances and not used anywhere else. So people our translators are struggling to interpret that, and they're struggling with the various denominations who want to read into what that means. And there are whole denominations that have a drinking culture, and they say Christ made wine and Christ drank wine, and he did. He made wine, 180 gallons of it at one time for the wedding of Canaan, and he did drink wine. But the problem we have here is that what was the type of wine that he created? And you don't know. I don't think that he would want to contribute to people's drunkenness, so I tend to think he created a very good wine that was sub-alcoholic or not alcoholic. And people that want to think that you can drink wine and just drink it, and it's high alcoholic content, take the other view. But the fact of the matter is that passage supports neither view, and you have to make an assumption from it. And Jesus did drink wine, but he was not a person who drank in any way that approached being a drunkard. And as we look into the history of wine making and drinking and that sort of thing, there's always been an abuse of wine in certain people's lives. They want to drink wine that's high alcoholic content. But the scriptures are very clear that priests, when they serve in the temple, are not to drink wine, period. They're not to imbibe anything that has any alcoholic content, period. We'll look at that passage later. Then we see a passage in Proverbs 31 where a godly woman is giving her son, who's going to become a king, advice, and that is the kings do not drink strong drink or wine, lest they forget what has been made as laws and they give a wrong interpretation. Judges, kings that are judges, and judges who are judges have to be very careful about the use of wine, lest they forget things. And so there are passages of Scripture that seem to indicate that people who are rulers, people who are priests and serving in the temple, and then Paul uses this to in some way inform what the standards for an elder should be. It can be proven that the cultures around the time of Christ and before and much after were cultures in the Middle East that did not drink strong wine. The way in which they drank it was they would take wine. Let's say you had a cup of wine, and then you took water and you added 3 cups to that, and that was the least it was diluted. But a lot of times they'd add 10 cups to that, and that'd be a gallon made from 1 cup. And what would happen is you'd have to drink a whole gallon of water to get that 1 ounce of alcohol that's in that little cup that you started with, 11 ounces, let's say. And you couldn't get the least bit tipsy drinking that much and that diluted. Back in the time, they had the latitude of Georgia and the panhandle of Florida there in Israel. And the grape harvest was somewhere in the neighborhood of July through August, and they would harvest those grapes. It'd be warm, and there were 2 processes that went on. One process was a bacterial process. The other process was a yeast process. When it was 75 degrees or higher, the process that dominated was the bacterial process. And when the bacteria acted on the wine, it would turn it to vinegar. When it was between 50 and 75 degrees, the yeast process would dominate. And when the yeast would digest the sugars, this byproduct, I'd say yeast P, was alcohol. And it would keep digesting that sugar in the wine and turn it into a certain percentage of alcohol until it reached about 11%, and then the yeast would die because it couldn't live in that alcohol. So the most that it could get would be 11%. And so what happened was that to keep the bacterial process, which turned it to vinegar, from making it too sour a drink, they learned to boil it, and they knew how to boil it back at that time. And when they boiled the wine to stop it from going into vinegar at 170 degrees before it would actually boil, the alcohol that was in it would evaporate. Now, distillers use this to their advantage. They have a still, and they bring the temperature up, and when the temperature gets to 170, the alcohol in that mash begins to vaporize. It goes up into the curling piping. It condenses, falls, and then they draw it off, and that's pure alcohol. They didn't know how to do that during the time of Christ. There was something going on maybe in Japan making their sake, but that was not extant in the area of Israel. And the people who took that wine that was alcoholic, they would drink that. That was considered barbaric. As a matter of fact, it is stated in Proverbs chapter 31, don't drink that stuff. Only if somebody's sick, give it to them as a drug so they can dull their pain. And so they, as a matter of course, didn't drink that. Here's another thing, and that was to preserve it. They would have to boil it, so keep it. So when you boiled it, the alcohol went out of it, the yeast was killed, the bacterial aspect was killed, and then it was preserved. So, my friends, most of what they had, especially in the spring of the year, would be preserved wine that was boiled, or if they did happen to have it stopped at the wine process of alcohol, they would dilute it to, they didn't have these gallons and gallons and gallons of wine like people have today. They had to dilute it and spread it so that it would be a drink that would be useful to more people. And many times they would use the wine that had alcohol in it primarily as an antiseptic just to purify the water. Now, my friends, there was a moderation, therefore, not only in the potency of the wine that they drank, but that they didn't drink very much of it. So it was a twofold moderation. And even with it being a twofold moderation, with it being diluted and then not drinking very much of it, we have the example of Timothy. And Timothy was abstaining from drinking any alcohol at all. It says here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 23, which is the same book that 1 Timothy 3:3 is in, talking about elders not being near wine or in the vicinity of wine or not drinking wine. It says here, Timothy, no longer, 1 Timothy 5:23, no longer drink water exclusively. Why in the world was he drinking water exclusively? He wasn't drinking wine at all. Well, he was taking to heart that as an elder you had to keep your wits about you. You didn't want to have anything that would dull or make you less sharp. And, even today we say you don't want to be drinking and driving, and yet people ignore that all the time. But we have people in this church and other churches have lost loved ones because of drunk drivers and their stupid way in which they drive when they have high alcohol in them. It's really a very bad thing to do. But it says no longer drink water exclusively, which is what he was doing, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. So there was a certain medicinal aspect to a certain amount of wine, and it was probably purify your water, Timothy. When I was in Africa, I was in Africa in 2 stints. Each one lasted about 5 weeks. And the first time I was there, I lived on a campus of a compound, teaching in the seminary there. And I was relieved to hear, because I'd heard the water in that area was not good. And they had a system so that when the water was pumped out of the well, mind you, down in the well, pumped out of it, there was a infrared process, ultraviolet process, and all the water that went through there was exposed to that, and it would kill the amoeba and bacteria that was in the water. And so we could drink it freely there. Now, the second time I went to Cameroon, I was in northern Cameroon, and we had water and it was as pure as we could get it. But then we would pour it into a water filtration system that had porous rock in it, and it went through that, took a good while for it to go through that porous rock. And then after we got it through the porous rock, we boiled it. And my friends, it would take hours every day to get the water that we needed so that we could supply 3 Americans who weren't used to the water over there. So an easier, simpler way, I suppose, would be to mix a little wine into that to have as an antiseptic, but we did not prefer to do that. And so it is a problem that you have to be concerned about. In the Americas, you can turn on the tap pretty near anywhere and drink the water right out of the tap without having to worry about it. It's really an amazing situation we have over here. But Timothy, he had, it says here, some frequent ailments, and it says use a little wine. It didn't even say use wine for your stomach's sake. It said use a little wine. That little means not very much. In my house, we have NyQuil. That NyQuil has an alcoholic content in it. I think I've used it once in the 5 years I've been pastor here, and that was just for a day. And so, my friends, I barely use any amount of alcohol in any quantity at all, even medicinally. And so I also am a person like Timothy. I follow his example and I abstain from wine or any use of alcohol. Now, I want to point out to you in Titus that when it says here in verse 7, not addicted to wine or not a user of wine would be more of my statement. That means that an elder must be very careful about dulling his senses. And this would also, by application, apply to any drugs that would dull his senses, illegal drugs, and even legal drugs that he might be taking. He has to be careful about that. Sometimes they might make it so he can't think clearly. You have to be careful about that. Sometimes it takes a while before you get used to the drug you're taking, and it does affect you mentally. You have to be careful about all those things. I want to show you that in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 8, it talks about deacons. It says, deacons likewise must be men of dignity, not double-tongued or addicted to much wine. Now, the word much wine, the word much is palo. And me ono palo, not much wine. It's all right for them to use the diluted wine that they had back at that time. But that is even more than what was said to Timothy. It said use a little wine, and they are not to use much wine. The elders are not supposed to use any wine ordinarily. And so I'm talking about the standards that we want in a pastor and why. If you look over at Proverbs chapter 31, Proverbs 31, I'm getting there. And here is a mother giving words of wisdom to King Lemuel. And he says in verse For it is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. Strong drink and wine are parallel. Strong drink would be in reference to perhaps like beer, and a wine would be parallel to it, a wine with high alcohol content. Well, if they're not supposed to drink strong drink or potent wine, then could they drink weak wine? And the answer is yes. Now, what happened to Nadab and Abihu was that when they set up the temple, and one of the things that they had was wine that was brought to them. The Israelites didn't have grape harvests. They didn't have vineyards. They had to trade for that to bring it to the temple. And so the priests would have this, and they were supposed to use it as oblation onto the table. And they weren't used to having wine, and they drank some of it, which was permissible, but evidently they had not diluted it, or they were added too much, and as a result, they were tipsy and they made a strange incense, not mixed it correctly. God burnt them to a crisp. You can read this in Leviticus chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, around in there. And then after that, God gives the order, you will not drink wine while serving in the temple. And because you are going to be serving the Lord, don't make strange fire. I'll burn you to a crisp. You need to have your wits about you, and when you were teaching the people. And so this was the order. Now that informs Paul's advice, and that is that elders are rule in the church, and elders teach in the church, and they are a spiritual example, and therefore the advice was that elders are not to be drinking wine. Well, my friends, unfortunately, when they see this, take a little wine for your stomach's sake, that is a little wine, even less than the do not drink much wine that is said to the deacons. And so this is just a medicinal use of it, and it's not a liberty that normally is afforded to pastors except if they are sick. There's also a testimony type situation where we want to be careful about drinking wine if it causes somebody to stumble. Now, this is primarily talking about drinking wine that's offered to idols. And so you don't want to drink that because it might cause somebody to stumble and think it's okay to drink that. Because that is no big deal if it's been offered to idols, but it is. And it says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 13, do you not know that those who perform sacred services, let's see, do I have the right passage? 9:13. Or is it 2 Corinthians 9? Well, I'm a little confused on that, so I'll go to Romans chapter 14 and verse 21. Sorry about that. I'll have that for you tomorrow in the service, correct. But Romans chapter 14 and verse 21, it says this, it is good not to eat meat, or to drink wine, or to do anything by which your brother stumbles. Now, if my drinking of wine would encourage somebody who had been an alcoholic to drink wine, or it would add kind of a stamp of approval to the drinking culture, and they said, well, Pastor Simpson drinks, why can't I drink? But they don't understand that if I were to drink, it would be for medicinal reasons. But there are some pastors who, in some denominations, that drink, and they drink very strong and potent drinks. And somebody says, well, what's wrong with it if a pastor does? And on the other hand, the pastor doesn't want to cause anybody to stumble. You know, there are people in this church that have lost loved ones because of alcoholics driving and killing people, dear people, loved ones. And I really don't want to have anything to do with that stuff. At any rate, that's how it is. And so let me give you a summary of things here. All right. So for moderation desired by some today to be compared to the moderation of biblical times, a glass of wine would have to be diluted by at least 3 to 1. That's minimal. Now, yes, it's true that there are people that did not dilute it, and they drank it, not diluted, and they would get drunk. But normally it was diluted. Now, the wine that people drink today is not diluted. People don't think to dilute it. They just drink it straight like that. 2 5-ounces of wine, 2 5-ounces cups of wine, drank in a 2-hour period, and you're well on your way to being drunk. So just keep in mind that even our deacons are to drink maybe a diluted wine, and even then, not very much. I believe that's all that I have to share on that. Now, there says something else here in 1 Timothy, not Timothy, but Titus. It says here, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious. Isn't it interesting that not quick-tempered and not pugnacious have in between not given to wine, not a user of wine. So you see that immediate context there, not pugnacious, not hot-tempered, and in between, not given to wine, because people who use wine, they can have their inhibitions taken back, and they might get a little mean, and that you don't want anybody to be mean. You don't want anybody to be too quick-tempered or losing their inhibitions. You don't want that in your pastors. And so it's good for them to stay away from that. But when it says not pugnacious, that means he's not a fighter. It means that he doesn't say, well, I don't like what you said. Let's go settle this out in the parking lot. You don't have a hothead as a pastor. It's not the way you want to have it. And so, my friends, not a fighter, not combatant, not hot-tempered, not a drinker of wine. These are all clumped together for a reason. So a man who keeps his temper under control, verbally or physically, is the type of man that you want. You don't want the other type as a leader of the church. He doesn't permit problems to escalate or become personal. And he's firm in his convictions, but gentle and long-suffering. You can find that in 2 Timothy 4:2. Well, I hope this has been informative to you. It's a difficult topic to deal with. I don't think there's a lot of good preaching on it. There's not a lot of good Bible study on it. And speaking of good Bible study, the dear people at my previous church allowed me to go through every single verse in the Bible that related to alcohol. Friends, there are a lot of them. I started in Genesis and moved all the way through the Bible. And I gave 40-minute Bible studies for 5 months straight just on this topic alone. And I put it in context, understood the culture, and by the time we got to the end of it, we pretty well knew what it said. Most people don't take the time to do that type of study. I'm thankful to the Lakeland Grace Brethren Church who permitted this. I'm also thankful that I had a gentleman who was trying to, at one time, have a business to make diesel fuel or gasohol, and he had it as a business, and he knew about distilling, and he was a great help to me in giving you all this information about fermentation and the bacterial process and the temperatures that were key. And God just put it all together. Plus, I have studied this. I made a 45-page paper and submitted it. It's a concerted study, and it was primarily to say, can an elder drink alcohol? And so this is primarily helping us understand that elders have to keep their wits about them. And I would have to say it's probably not too bad an idea for the rank and file, too. God's blessing upon you as you consider this passage.